Black Christmas is a 1974 Canadian horror film directed by Bob Clark. Based on the screenplay by A. Roy Moore, the film stars Olivia Hussey, Margot Kidder, John Saxon, Coeur DeLay, and Andrea Martin, and follows the Christmas break at a sorority house which has been plagued by a series of mysterious and deranged phone calls. As the girls mainly brush it off as a prank caller, the audience knows from the very opening of the film, even before we get to meet the main characters, someone has broken into the sorority house, adding an air of dread as we hear the caller and know that this is going to get so much worse than anyone on screen realizes.
Tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different because you've given them that information.
When I first watched Black Christmas, three main thoughts occurred to me. I was surprised at how well the film had actually aged in terms of creepiness. I thought it was a radically feminist and countercultural film, but to a modern sensibility, I feel that I can appreciate the subtlety with which those messages are presented. Serving as a precursor to the slasher genre, here is a film that subverts some of those genre's tropes, which could be understood as having a somewhat conservative attitude.
For instance, number one, you can never have sex. Big no-no!
When I watched the film, I wondered, why is John Carpenter's Halloween considered the father of the slasher genre? Black Christmas was a success upon release, and it has since become considered a classic horror film, but for some reason, I rarely, if ever, hear of this film as being mentioned as any kind of groundbreaking horror film or the first of its kind. Side note, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre could be credited as equally influential on the genre, but I feel like it is already spoken about in the light that it deserves. Fun fact, Black Christmas and Texas Chainsaw were actually released on the exact same day, October 11th, 1974, and when you compare the box office success of the two films, I'm going to assume that Texas Chainsaw Massacre overshadowed Black Christmas, and this could be a contributing factor in Black Christmas becoming a more obscure film. In researching this video, I read Men, Women, and Chainsaws by Carol J. Clover. Most people who've heard of this book know it for coining the term final girl, which is pretty cool, but there's actually so much more to this book than that one aspect, and I think it's an absolute must-read for fans of horror films. I decided to read this book because I had really wanted to for a long time, and when I decided to tackle this subject for the basis of a video essay, I felt it was the perfect opportunity to do so. And I was somewhat surprised to find that Black Christmas is never mentioned in the book. Not once. While some truly obscure films are mentioned and even significantly analysed. So I was somewhat disappointed, but in many ways Black Christmas does and does not fit into the formula of the final girl established by Clover, which is something we will explore as we progress. But for now, I want to give my own subjective analysis of the film, why I think it is a great piece of horror and feminist cinema, and explain my subjective opinion as to why I think Black Christmas is a better film than Halloween. Subjectively, it's subjective. The first time I watched Black Christmas, it quickly became a favourite horror film of mine. In considering the earliest entries into the slasher genre, the genesis of the slasher, Carol Clover highlights that it began as a new form of horror in the 1970s and the 1980s, as a reflection of the time in which the genre was taking form. We have, in short, a cinematic formula with a 26-year-old history, of which the first phase, from 1960 to 1974, is dominated by a film clearly rooted in the sensibility of the 1950s, while the second phase, bracketed by the two Texas Chainsaw films from 1974 and 1986, responds to the values of the late 60s and early 70s. The women's liberation movement and questions of gender dynamics, which saw a rise in social consciousness with the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, according to Clover's writing, marks a lot of elements at play in the slasher film as a whole, from the boyish qualities of the final girl to the recurring from the boyish qualities of the final girl to the recurring theme of gender or sexual frustration among the killers in these stories. Norman Bates is a figure in a kind of gender distress. Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees are triggered to kill by acts of sexual promiscuity. Perhaps not literally in Michael Myers' case, but the narrative does play into that theme of the danger of sex. And these are themes that equally permeate Black Christmas. Billy is a character living in a somewhat nebulous gender distress. When he's talking to Agnes, he's living in a childish pre-masculine roleplay, but when he's on the phone to the girls at the sorority house, he is sexually vulgar. In researching Bob Clark and Roy Moore's inspirations for the film, two cases in particular caught my attention. Primarily the 1943 murder of Wilhelmina Dawson McCreary Webster at the hands of her 14-year-old son George, and the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs, which is believed by some to have been inspired by the 1950 murder of 13-year-old Janet Christman.
She's only 13 years old, Lieutenant, and...
On November 17th, 1943, George Webster used a baseball bat to murder his mother, Wilhelmina Dawson McCreary Webster. This incident had been cited as an inspiration for Roy Moore when he was writing the script of Black Christmas. George had been described by his classmates following the incident as behaving strangely. He was once a piano champion who had started skipping classes. He also attacked several of his siblings and a family friend, Sylvia Cust, who was staying with the family at the time of the attack, but Mrs. McCreary Webster was the only fatality. On December 3rd, George was charged with his mother's murder, but ultimately he was transferred to a mental health institution, and he had been declared unfit to stand trial. Information on the case remains sparse, at least compared to the next case I will be discussing. Janet Christman was murdered on March 18, 1950, while babysitting Ed and Anne Romack's 3-year-old son, who, astonishingly, was still in bed, asleep and unharmed, when the Romacks returned home and found Janet's body. Now, I don't know if Clark and Moore were inspired by the case of Janet's murder as well as the urban legend, but when I did my own research into the legend's origin, I felt that much of the details reflect the themes the film alludes to. From the very beginning of the investigation, there were impediments in the progress of actually solving Janet's murder. To quote an article from truecrimearticles.wordpress.com, unfortunate complications soon arose, however, when Lieutenant Joe Douglas from the city police, a different jurisdiction that hadn't any authority since the Romacks lived 100 yards out of city limits, arrived at the scene and attempted to take rein of the investigation. The battle of leadership had the separate agencies being uncooperative with one another, and though answers unraveled quickly, there were many disagreements amongst the two groups. If you're curious about this case and want to find out more about Janet Christman's murder, I recommend episode 82 of the Fresh Hell podcast, and I just recommend that podcast in general. If you love true crime and all things weird and mysterious and macabre, it's great. What I find very telling about the details of the investigation in comparative light to the film is that the police acting in their own interests rather than solving the crime is something I think that is alluded to in Nash's behavior. In many horror films, the audience can often ask, why don't they just go to the police? Whereas Black Christmas is the film where the characters do go to the police, and the police are involved but simply uninterested or ineffective.
I don't know if it's any consolation, but 90% of the time, girls are reported missing from the college. They're at a cabin somewhere with a boyfriend.
Thanks. But that's not much consolation.
Not all the police, of course. Lieutenant Fuller is a good police officer, and he takes the girls' claims seriously. Although Janet's murder remains an unsolved case, there are many fingers pointed to one particular suspect, Robert Mueller. Muller had been friends with the Romacks, and he had in fact been out with them the night of the murder, excusing himself for an hour or two, claiming that he had arranged a meeting with the local doctor about his son's health. This was a claim that was later denied by the doctor. Muller had been described as being a bit of a pervert by Anne Romack. She said Muller had once attempted to grope her breast while he was visiting the house to help her with a dress. Muller was a tailor. Ed Romack had said of Muller, he had a lustful eye for virgin women and spoke about having a desire to defile someone young. There were several factors that heavily implicated Muller in the murder, and personally, I feel he was the one most likely responsible. In May 1950, the authorities questioned Muller. However, after Muller was submitted to and passed a lie detector test, which today are known to be unreliable indicators of guilt, Muller was released, and no one was ever charged with the murder of Janet Christman. And I think it's stories like this one that makes me think that Black Christmas, as well as being a very scary movie, is really trying to say something larger about the nature of misogyny in 20th century life, from the extreme psychopathy of wanting to defile someone young to the passive acceptance of misogyny and misogynistic ideals in society.
Darling, you can't rape a townie.
Why do I feel the need to compare Black Christmas to Halloween? I think it's because whenever I hear people discuss the history of the slasher, Halloween is always called the first, or the film that defined the genre, that Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho was the grandfather, and that Halloween was the father. But when I saw Black Christmas, which was released 4 years earlier, I thought that there was clearly a precedence for this before Halloween, and in my opinion, I thought that it was a much finer tuning of the slasher that had been set up by Psycho. Why is it that Halloween is remembered as this cultural touchstone, but Black Christmas is a cult film with a loyal but smaller following of horror fans? In doing my research, I found one possibility. In the opening of this video, I said that Black Christmas was released on October 11th, 1974, the exact same day as another iconic horror gem, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Black Christmas made a box office total of $4.1 million, which adjusted for inflation is over $24.7 million today, whereas Texas Chainsaw made $30.9 million, which today is over $186 million. And I think when comparing the financial success of these two films, it's easy to see that one overshadowed the other and was able to make a more lasting impression, particularly considering that they were released in a time before the internet or streaming, and the only means of seeing a film was in the cinema or catching it on TV years later, unlike today where a film may have a modest box office success, but it could quickly find an audience outside of the cinema. This film had been forgotten about to the point where Men, Women and Chainsaws, one of the most influential texts on the horror genre of the 20th century, doesn't even make a mention of Black Christmas. Going back to the shots of the film, Clover writes of Halloween's POV shot. The device is probably the most widely imitated and widely parodied cliché of modern horror, but doesn't acknowledge that Black Christmas used it first. When considering whether John Carpenter was heavily inspired by Black Christmas, it becomes interesting to try and figure out just how much he was influenced by Bob Clark. Clark himself has claimed that the entire plot of Halloween comes from an idea he had about a Black Christmas sequel, an idea he says he shared with Carpenter. He asked me if I was ever going to do a sequel, and I said no. I was through with horror. I didn't come into the business to just do horror. He said, well, what would you do if you did do a sequel? I said it would be the next year, and the guy would have actually been caught, escape from a mental institution, go back to the house, and they would start all over again. And I would call it Halloween. Now, I personally choose to take Clark's claims with a pinch of salt. Although, objectively speaking, I don't have a reason to believe or disbelieve him, I just find it difficult to believe that he also came up with the title. I don't know, that just seems a little too good to be true. The previous quote comes from an article I found on bloodydisgusting.com, and it later goes on to discuss Clark never accused Carpenter of plagiarism. The truth is, John didn't copy Black Christmas. He wrote a script, directed the script, did the casting. Halloween is his horror film, and besides, the script came to him already titled anyway. There does seem to be something a little contradictory in these quotes from Clark, because he says that he was going to call his sequel to Black Christmas Halloween, but he also admits that John Carpenter wrote the script. But then he also says that John Carpenter received a script with the title Halloween, so I'm just not entirely sure what to make of that. So I don't want to say that Carpenter stole from Black Christmas, that's not what I'm saying at all, because how could the title Halloween come to Carpenter if he was the one who co-wrote the script with Deborah Hill? But as I said before, I'm sure he lifted English is my first language, I really have no excuse for this. I don't want to say that Carpenter stole from Black Christmas, that's not what I'm saying at all, because how could the title of the Halloween script come to Carpenter if he was the one who co-wrote it with producer Deborah Hill? But as I said before, I'm sure he's lifted many elements that worked in Black Christmas and remolded them to a greater financial and cultural success in Halloween.
Good for her!
Now, I just want to take a moment to dissect whether Jess Bradford is a typical final girl as established in Carol Clover's book. The final girl is boyish, in a word. Just as the killer is not fully masculine, she is not fully feminine. Not in any case feminine in the way of her friends. According to Clover, the use of a phallic murder weapon by the killers of slasher films is a part of a symbolic game of androgyny that occurs between a killer who is unable to have a typical sexual expression and a final girl who is boyish in nature and typically a virgin. She is unable to perform the normative sexual role of cisgender women. However, I think it's interesting that Jess as a character does not conform to this trope. Not only has she engaged in sexual activity, but she's come to the decision to terminate the traditional end goal of that role, namely reproduction. And I just want to clarify that when I say that reproduction is the end goal of sex, this is not an endorsement of that view. I'm merely making the point that the theme of premarital sex as a danger, as is often the case with the tradition of the sanctity of the nuclear family, it is a tradition that has been heavily enforced in the European and American tradition. And I do wonder if this is why Black Christmas was an omission from Clover's book. This is a true subversion of the final girl trope as it has come to be understood in horror cinema. Not only is our protagonist not a virgin, but she is seeking to get an abortion only 1 year after the legislation of Roe v. Wade in the United States. When I began writing this video, the 2022 decision to overturn Roe v. Wade had yet to occur in the United States. But now that it has, I would claim in some respects, having a main character seek an abortion is rather radical, even by today's standards. It shouldn't be, in my opinion, but it is. I first saw Halloween when I was about 16 years old. I had recently seen Wes Craven's Scream for the first time, and that really sparked an interest in horror for me. And of course, Halloween, being the father of the slasher genre, was the natural next step in exploring those films, especially because it had such an influence on Scream. I admit I find my initial reaction to Halloween a little hard to remember, but I think at the time I found it a little underwhelming. At least that was until night came and I actually let my imagination get the better of me. But in subsequent viewings, I do understand why it is a classic. There is still something very unnerving about the minimalist presence of Michael Myers in Haddonfield. How he just pops into your view, staring at you. How rather simplistic he is. All he wants to do is kill, and nothing will stop him from doing that, to the point where he actually defies the laws of nature. When rewatching Halloween for this essay, in comparison to Black Christmas, it occurred to me that Halloween is very interested in invoking something mythological or folkloric in its storytelling, as opposed to the very gritty procedural reality of Black Christmas. In the middle of class, Laurie's teacher discusses the nature of fate and makes reference to a Samuels and a Constein. In the classroom, Laurie is asked to answer the question.
Costain wrote that fate was somehow related only to religion, whereas Samuels felt that, well, fate was like a natural element, like earth, air, fire, and water.
That's right.
This is clearly a reference to Michael Myers himself. Not having any particular motivation for his actions, he's just this primal force, like fate, that just happens upon Laurie and her friends. Contrast this to Billy, who is also heavily shrouded in mystery, but he exhibits a behavior and potentially gives a key or an indication to his motivations. He has tantrums and dialogues with Agnes. I think Michael Myers could be an embodiment of a collective 20th century anxiety about serial killers. Perhaps that is an anxiety that we still hold today, given the success of true crime as a genre in podcasts, YouTube videos, documentaries on Netflix. But Michael Myers is the form of serial killer, or as he's called in the end credits, the shape. There are several references to the boogeyman throughout the movie, another form of an unnameable evil that will get you. Tommy's bullies constantly scare him, telling him that the boogeyman's going to get you. Laurie is charged with protecting Tommy from the boogeyman when she's babysitting, and she promises that he's not real until the end of the film when she asks Dr. Loomis.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
The cemetery groundskeeper alludes to urban legends.
You know, every town has something like this happen. I remember over in Russellville, old Charlie Bowles, about 15 years ago. One night he finished dinner, and he excused himself from the table, and he went out to the garage, and he got himself a hacksaw.
All these references add to Halloween's mythological leanings. What is the boogeyman but a myth that we tell children to explain the dangers of the world around them? And all mythology is a culture's stories used to explain the world around that culture. So when making this comparison between the folkloric nightmare of Michael Myers and the all too real horror of Billy, I'm stuck with the question, is Black Christmas better than Halloween? Is Halloween better than Black Christmas? This, of course, is going to come down to a matter of personal taste. Maybe it's a question of whether you prefer escapism or realism in your horror. Or if you don't have a preference between the two, as I don't think that I particularly do, then maybe it's a question of filmmaking, storytelling, or execution. From the filmmaking, the writing, the world building, the characters, and the performances, I feel that Black Christmas provides a much richer and cathartic experience as an audience member. In Halloween, I think Jamie Lee Curtis lifts a lot of the film on her shoulders, and the same is true in more recent additions to the franchise. I was definitely more invested in her performance in David Gordon Green's reboot than I was in any of the other characters.
I raised your mother means that she hates me, but that she's prepared for the horrors of this world, then I can live with that.
In Black Christmas, there is a palpable chemistry between all of the characters. Every scene with Barb is charged with this brazen anger. Jess at first glance may seem like the typical soft-spoken final girl, but as the film progresses, yes, we see her in fear, but she never once backs down. She always stands her ground and would even go so far as to fight back against this deranged killer in the chance that she could save her friends. The characters in Black Christmas are given the full complexity of being people. As Bob Clark said, college students, even in 1974, are astute people. They're not fools. They're not all bikinis, beach blankets, and bingo. Now, compare this with the characters in Halloween, where Laurie is the only teen character who isn't completely preoccupied with sex. I honestly think the most complex dialogue we hear from Linda is,
"So who cares? I always forget my chemistry book and my math book and my English book and my, let's see, my French book. And, well, who needs books anyway? I don't need books. I always forget all my books. I mean..."
And I don't mean to say that having sexually active characters in a film is a bad thing, but when it's all there is to a character, I personally just don't find it all that engaging. In Black Christmas, it's because we get more complex characters who get to have conflict and a real world dynamic with one another. Characters who are all played by very good actors. It makes it all the more compelling when Billy actually kills Barb or Claire or Mrs. McHenry. Again, this is all just my opinion, but I think the ensemble of Black Christmas is much stronger than in Halloween. That could also be a question of a well-rounded script given that ensemble more to work with. Clark himself said he wanted to make changes to the script, in particular the dialogue, saying the script was too much like a straightforward slasher. Halloween, as great as it is, and it is great, it's one of those films that you only need to see once, but the details in Black Christmas gives the audience more to dissect and speculate about upon repeated viewings. Unlike the simplicity of Michael Myers, it gives the audience a mystery to engage with. Another ground for comparison between Black Christmas and Halloween is which is scarier. I think horror is a lot like comedy in that fear and humor are both near universal and entirely personal. What is hilarious to me won't be hilarious to everyone, and what is terrifying to you may not be terrifying to me. I don't really believe in the supernatural, so I can drop the fear Michael Myers had on me as a teenager. Now I can say, Michael Myers, he's just the boogeyman. It's just a film. No one can actually take 6 bullets, fall from a balcony, get up and walk around for an entire franchise. But Billy is a little more trouble for me to shake off. Yes, he's a work of fiction, but it's a fiction that definitely has roots in some of the real horrors of contemporary life. In fact, the initial television premiere of Black Christmas had to be postponed by NBC as it was set to air only 2 weeks after Ted Bundy attacked 4 female students at Florida State University, killing 20-year-old Lisa Levy and 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, and even taking into consideration the rise of internet subcultures like the phenomena of incels. It's clear to see that the misogynistic horror portrayed in Black Christmas may have changed since the 1970s, and things may have improved now that we've had decades of progress in gender equality and reforms in laws about protecting women against violence. I think it's pretty undeniable the horror that Billy could be seen as representing still exists in our world today. It's definitely something I find myself thinking about whenever I see an Andrew Tate or a Davis Arini or Elliot Rodger or any one of these seemingly endless misogynistic creeps talk about how they are owed recognition as one of the good ones who deserve women, and whenever they don't receive that recognition, they lash out, verbally or, in the worst cases, physically, against innocent people. So yeah, that was my first attempt at a video essay. I quite enjoyed it, and I hope you found it in some way interesting or thought-provoking, and if you agreed or disagreed with me, I highly recommend that you let me know in the comments section down below. I have a few ideas of other video essays I'd like to make. It might be a bit slow in the meanwhile because I'm actually attending university at the minute, so probably won't be until the summer before I get back to anything that looks like this. But if you stuck around to the end, thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you soon.